So, this is part 2 of my response to Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes versus Women series, and judging by the fact that she's making a lot more of these videos, it would seem that my work will not be complete for quite some time. So, if you are all interested, and I hope you are, I would suggest you grab a seat, maybe grab a bucket of popcorn, maybe grab a puke bucket while you're at it, and sit down and get comfy, because we'll be here for a while. Now, before I start, I'd like to give a fair warning that a lot of the stuff I'll be saying might sound very repetitive. A lot of it might be a bit of a rehash from my first video, but I'll try and supplement it as much as possible with other material or other thoughts that come to mind. And unavoidably, this I really can't do anything about because a lot of this video is pretty much a rehash of her first video. And judging by the same formula that these two videos have been following, that's what we're going to see for the next 4 videos or so. So, what can I do? Well, I will try my best to refute her arguments, and I will try not to bore my audience or drive them insane. With that out of the way, let's get to it. So, Anita first makes the point that the damsel in distress trope is really just a plot device to further the story that centers around guys. And I know I've already addressed this before, but I feel it necessary to address it again. I don't honestly think the damsel in distress trope is necessarily a bad thing, and I will illustrate a few reasons why. First of all, it's an inevitable reflection of our culture, and it's an inevitable reflection of biology. Women, unfortunately, tend to be easier victims than men. Not all the time, but usually they do. And unfortunately, this does show in our pop culture. Secondly, having someone kidnapped or otherwise incapacitated is not so much of a sexist thing as much as it is a very convenient plot device. And we use it in not only games, but common literature, in movies, in just pretty much every other form of media. So why don't we see it the other way around? Why aren't women technically being equal in our society? Why aren't women being portrayed as the saviors, while men as the victims? The answer to that is, well, games are made usually by men for a male audience, because the gaming community is pretty much male-dominated. And I wouldn't necessarily say this is a problem with the community or the culture, or why aren't more women playing games? I wouldn't ask that question, because maybe women just aren't interested in games. Why aren't more men reading Cosmopolitan? Maybe men just aren't interested in Cosmo. Sarkeesian and other feminists will whine and complain that men always view women as victims because guy gamers like to indulge in the damsel in distress trope. Well, I think of it as pretty hypocritical considering how they don't turn their head 180 degrees and see for themselves what women do in their spare time. You know, how Cosmo objectifies men just as much as games sometimes objectify women. Even if all games were specifically designed to subjugate women, and all men were trying to subjugate women by objectifying them, it's not like girls do any better in this department. So I had to ask Anita and any single one of my detractors, who are you trying to fool with this double standard? Really? And honestly, I don't see anything inherently misogynistic about the damsel in distress trope. There is nothing wrong with going out to save someone you love. Just because a woman happens to be a victim does not mean that it's a sign of patriarchy. Only radical feminists would see that because they see patriarchy in everything. Sarkeesian then elaborates on this damsel in distress trope by examining said damsel in certain other scenarios where having a damsel in distress would somehow lead to the buddings of intimacy, love, or romance. As cruel as it sounds, if the male protagonist didn't at least get some reward, in my opinion, I see the game as pretty pointless. And, ooh, does that mean that you're a raging misogynist, truth of the people? Definitely. I'm an evil, immoral monster feminazis come at me. If the male protagonist in question goes through all sorts of shit just to get through to the one he loves, and she kind of puts him in the friend zone, that's going to inevitably disappoint a lot of male gamers, in the same way that if a woman tries to flirt with a guy in multiple different ways, and he gives her the cold shoulder, that's inevitably going to make her feel pretty bad. That's just human nature. It's especially interesting, though, considering how most games don't usually end in this way. For example, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Link gets sent 7 years in the past. He doesn't get any reward for all of his hard work. Mario, at best, gets a kiss from the princess after all his hard work. You know, for the amount of work that these guys have to do just to get to these damsels in distress, they sure aren't capitalizing a lot on this subjugation of women, are they? Sarkeesian then elaborates on the trope she names the euthanized damsel, which involves a damsel in distress, and near the end of your quest, the player has to euthanize said damsel, usually because of a disfigurement or something wrong with the damsel as a product of the villain. So, for example, maybe the villain possesses said damsel, and you have to fight her and kill her, just to end her pain. Sarkeesian says, and I quote, "These stories conjure up supernatural situations in which domestic violence perpetrated by men against women who have lost control of themselves not only appears justified, but appears as an act of altruism done for the woman's own good." To which I respond, what? So she doesn't consider that maybe these damsels in question might be in great pain or suffering, or they don't want to cause suffering in return, so they make a great sacrifice and ask the hero to sacrifice something of his or her own. No, of course not. So if the woman I love was being tortured in front of me, it would not be heroic and selfless and honorable to grant her last wish, to euthanize her, to save her from pain? Would you rather me let her suffer? Well, gee, thanks, Miss Sarkeesian. I guess I'm empowering women now. Finally, you say, and I quote, "Games don't exist in a vacuum, and therefore can't be divorced from the larger cultural context of the real world, and that these games promoting damsel in distress tropes are really in bad taste because they're a reflection of what happens in the real world, especially domestic violence against women. And if you think that it's in bad taste to show violence against women, well, violence against men is an equally large problem. Domestic violence against husbands in particular is very unreported and not even taken remotely seriously by the police. And yet when you consider the cultural context of domestic violence against men, hitting guys in video games, TV shows, and whatnot is not only, not considered taboo, it's considered funny sometimes. So no, I wouldn't say that women being portrayed in a weaker position or women being shown as a victim is necessarily a reflection of the general thoughts of society being patriarchal. I think you need a lot more evidence than that. It has occurred to me that Anita Sarkeesian is probably not a gamer, because anyone who's anyone, at least in my opinion, who plays games would know that they play games not to criticize pop culture, not to examine every little itty-bitty detail and find what personally does or does not agree with their own personal values, but they play games because they're fun. Because games are immersing. Maybe the story is good, or the characters are good, or the gameplay and music is good. Stuff like that. People generally play games to escape from reality, to have fun, to let loose, and be someone else for a change. No one in the real world would jack a bunch of cars, beat up a bunch of hookers, and take their money. Or at least not a lot of people. And yet, we have a lot of people playing Grand Theft Auto. Are you going to say they're all inherently violent, misogynistic, evil people? No, that's a horrible assumption. I encourage anyone who doesn't agree with the overall message of this video, please go out for yourself, interview a bunch of gamers and see whether or not they actually endorse domestic violence, or they endorse the subjugation of women. I would like to see the results of those little surveys that people do, because I honestly don't think that there is as much inherent misogyny in gaming as Sarkeesian and other feminists would like to think. But don't take my word for it. Thanks for watching, and may the truth always be heard. Peace.